He believed the world was data. But when his plane crashes deep in the Indian jungle, analyst Jake Peters finds his algorithms useless. To survive, he must trust an ancient wisdom, not his own intellect.
Jake, the hyper-analyst Peters, believed in data. To him, the world was a giant, perfectly structured database where every problem had a solution algorithm. His mind was a powerful processor, capable of finding that algorithm. His smartphone was an extension of his mind, a key to the global network of knowledge. The plane was a small buzzing insect in the vast sky. Outside the window stretched an endless carpet of emerald green, the western Ghats of India, the jungle. Jake had downloaded an offline map of the region, just in case. He was always prepared. The pilot, a silver-haired, cheerful Indian named Kapil, was saying something briskly over the radio, but through the engine noise, Jake only caught fragments. Monsoon. Turbulence. Then, the world turned upside down. It wasn't turbulence. It was an impact. A dull, bone-crunching sound that drowned out the engine's roar. The plane nosedived and plummeted down into the green abyss. Orange life jackets popped out of the seats with a foolish hiss. Screams. The crack of branches tearing through metal like paper. Impact. Deafening silence. And then, noise. Not the city's hum, but a deafening, all-consuming roar of life. Cicadas, birds, the rustle of leaves, and the monotonous, unceasing drumming of raindrops on the fuselage. Rain. The monsoon season. Jake regained consciousness as something hairy and multi-legged crawled across his face. He shuddered, brushed the creature away, and sat up. His head was spinning, but all his limbs were intact. He was buckled in. The seatbelt had saved his life. He looked around. The cabin was torn in half. The tail section had disappeared into the thicket. In the front, still in his seat, sat Kapil. He was alive, but his face was contorted with pain. A shard of the control column was embedded in his thigh, and a dark crimson stain was slowly spreading across his trousers. "Water," whispered the pilot. Jake, acting on autopilot, reached for his backpack under the seat. His laptop was shattered. The power bank, intact, and his smartphone, in its protective waterproof case, was also fine. Charge, 68%. No signal, of course, but he wasn't completely cut off. He had offline maps, a downloaded survival encyclopedia, and a plant identification app. He retrieved a water bottle from another backpack and held it to Kapil's lips. "Hey, hang in there. Help is on the way." He lied. Besides them, there was one other survivor, an elderly Indian man in a simple cotton shirt who had been sitting in the back. He didn't look scared. He looked focused. His dark, deep-set eyes studied the surrounding jungle with an expression as if he were reading a familiar, though unpleasant, book. He was muttering something in his language, rubbing his bruised shoulder. "I'm Jake," the American told him. The old man looked at him, then at the smartphone in his hand, and said nothing. He simply pointed a finger at the sky, where slanting gray light poured through a gap in the canopy, and shook his head. "Rain. Bad." Jake activated his survival protocols. First, shelter. Second, water. Third, signal. He found the emergency beacon in the tail section. Smashed to pieces. Nothing to signal with. Shelter. The plane was a flimsy shelter, but the roof was still holding somehow. He stretched a piece of canvas over a hole to keep the rain out. Water. It was raining. Problem solved, it seemed. He placed an empty bottle under a trickle dripping from the edge of the canvas. A minute later, he took his first sip. The water was warm, with a taste of plastic and dust, but it was water. He felt a strange excitement. This was a real task,
a task for his intellect. He opened the Wilderness Survival app and started reading. Locating food sources. The old man, who had introduced himself in broken English as Ashwin, watched him with silent bewilderment. When Jake tried to start a fire by rubbing sticks together, as shown in a YouTube video, Ashwin snorted, pulled out a matchbox wrapped in plastic from his pocket, and silently lit a small fire from dry branches collected under the dense canopies. The first lesson was learned. Theory and practice were different universes. But the main problem was Koppel. The pilot was delirious, his face burning. The wound was infected. Jake remembered the section on infections. Without antibiotics, he had 3 days at most. Jake opened the map. The nearest village marked on it was called Manali. As the crow flies, about 30 kilometers. Through the jungle in the monsoon season, 2, maybe 3 days' journey. "We have to go," he said to Ashwin, showing him the screen. "To the village, for help, for medicine." Ashwin looked at the map, then at the jungle, then at Kapil. He shook his head again. "River," he uttered. "Big water. Dangerous. Long walk." "We can make a stretcher, carry him," insisted Jake. Ashwin looked at him as if he had suggested flying to the moon. He touched Kapil's forehead and shook his head grimly. He wouldn't survive the journey. "Herbs," said Ashwin. "Need herbs. Or..." He looked somewhere deep into the jungle. "Old place. Temple. There might be help." Jake looked at the old man skeptically. Herbs versus antibiotics? An old temple versus civilization? It sounded like superstition. He looked at his phone. 64% charge. He opened the offline plant database. If herbs, then only those confirmed by science. "Okay," he said. "I'll look for medicine. You stay with him, try to find your herbs. If I don't find anything or don't return in 12 hours, you go to the village." Agreed? Ashwin looked at him for a long time and then slowly nodded. His eyes held not approval, but rather curiosity, as if he were observing a young wild animal leaving its den for the first time. Jake charged the power bank from the solar panel on his phone case, another just-in-case item, took the water bottle, a piece of mirror for signals, and, with a last glance at the delirious pilot, stepped out of the plane. The rain lashed his face. The air was thick as soup. The jungle swallowed him with his first step. His city sneakers sank into the mud. His expensive, breathable jacket was instantly soaked through. He took out his phone, opened the compass and the map. He was the hyper-analyst. He was ready for this game. The jungle seemed to smirk back. The first hour was a nightmare. Every step was a struggle. Vines snagged his feet, thorns tore his clothes. Strange sausage-like fruits hung around. Jake pointed his phone's camera at them. The app thought and displayed, "Undetermined, possibly poisonous." "Thanks, Captain Obvious." He was looking for plants that might have antiseptic properties. Turmeric, aloe. But what did they look like in the wild? In online pictures, they were neat, cultivated. Here, everything was gigantic, chaotic, and wet. He came across a mushroom resembling one he'd seen in a survival documentary. "Rich in protein," the narrator had said. Jake reached for it, but a sharp bird cry stopped him. He flinched and pulled his hand back. What if he was wrong? Poisoning alone here was a death sentence. His confidence began to drain, like his phone's battery under the load of all the running apps. 58%. Suddenly, the path in front of him came alive. Something long, scaly, and copper-colored, slowly slithered over a fallen log. A snake. Jake froze, his heart pounding wildly. He didn't know if it was venomous or not. His app was useless. He couldn't get close enough to take a picture. He stood motionless until the snake disappeared into the foliage. His clothes were now wet, not from rain, but from cold sweat. He moved on, but his steps were cautious, almost creeping. Every rustle made him flinch. He saw a stream. Water, clean. He was about to rush towards it, but remembered the paragraph about parasites. Boil. Needed to boil. But how? He had no pot. He hunched under a tree, feeling hunger and fatigue taking over. His analytical mind, always so fast, was now stalling, overloaded by the chaos of smells, sounds, sensations. He took out his phone. 52%. Opened the map. By his calculations, he had covered less than 2 kilometers. It was a failure. Then he heard a noise. Not a natural one, a metallic clank. And voices. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced him. Rescue! He rushed towards the sound, pushing through vines. He emerged into a small clearing. No rescuers. An old, rusty tractor stood there, almost completely swallowed by the jungle. Next to it, a half-collapsed hut. An abandoned village? He checked the map. Nothing marked. Voices came from the hut. He crept closer and peeked inside. 2 men in dirty clothes were sitting there, dividing something. And next to them stood rifles. Poachers. One of them looked up and stared directly at the gap where Jake stood. Their eyes met. The Indian's eyes held no surprise, no pity, only a cold, predatory assessment. Jake didn't wait. He turned and ran. He heard loud shouts and the sounds of pursuit behind him. His movie knowledge was useless. His phone was useless. The only thing working was instinct, the instinct of prey. He ran, not choosing his path, branches whipping his face. He tripped over a root and flew down into thick fern growth. He froze, pressing himself to the ground, trying to breathe quietly. Footsteps approached. The men were saying something in their language, laughing. They passed within a couple of meters of him, not even looking in his direction. They were searching for him on the path, while he lay off to the side in the green gloom. They left. Jake lay still for another 10 minutes, listening to his heart slowly calm down. He was alive, but not thanks to technology or analytics, thanks to blind luck and animal fear. He looked at his phone. 48%. The map that hadn't shown him the poachers or the abandoned village, his plant database that couldn't distinguish an edible mushroom from a poisonous one. For the first time in his life, Jake, the hyper-analyst Peters, felt that his mind was an unreliable tool. And that was scarier than any snake. He had to get back to the plain, empty-handed, but with one bitter, priceless lesson. The jungle was not a database. It was a living, hostile, and utterly indifferent organism, unconcerned with his calculations. It took Jake over 2 hours to get back to the plain. He trudged, barely looking where he was going, his mind filled with shame and fear. He, who could optimize the business processes of a multi-million-dollar company, was helpless facing a simple walk in the woods. Poachers. He hadn't even considered that possibility. His map was empty, but the jungle was not. He reached the crash site as dusk began to fall. The rain hadn't let up for a second. The first thing he saw was Ashwin, squatting by a small fire lit under a canopy made from a huge leaf. He was grinding something in a small metal bowl. "Kapil?" Jake asked hoarsely. Ashwin jerked his head towards the plain. "Sleeping. High fever." Jake looked inside. Kapil lay on an improvised bedding of leaves, his breathing rapid and shallow. His face was covered in sweat, despite the coolness. The wound on his thigh was swollen and had turned a purplish blue. It smelled sweetly and unpleasantly. Gangrene. I didn't find anything," Jake admitted, feeling his face burn. "No medicine, no village. Just poachers." Ashwin looked up at him but said nothing. He simply handed him the bowl. Inside was a paste of crushed leaves and roots, emitting a sharp, spicy aroma. "For the wound," the old man explained. "Draws out pus. Not completely, but for a while." Jake looked skeptically at this mud, but what choice did he have? He silently took the bowl and entered the plane. Carefully, trying not to wake the pilot, he applied the paste to the wound around the shard. Kapil moaned in his sleep but didn't wake. Returning to the fire, Jake sank to the ground. His strength left him. "Your herbs, do they really work?"
Ashwin shrugged. "Worked for my father, for my grandfather. Not like your pills, but the jungle gives what it can." "We can't stay here," said Jake, not with his former confidence, but with desperation. "He needs antibiotics, real ones." "Tomorrow," said Ashwin, "we go to the temple." "What temple? Why are you so sure about it?" Ashwin was silent for a moment, looking at the fire. "My grandfather took cattle there during droughts. There is always water, and people, sages, lived there long ago. Treated people. Maybe something remains." "That's anecdotal evidence," Jake exploded. "I have a map, coordinates. By my calculations, if we go northeast—" "Did your map show you the poachers?" Ashwin asked calmly. Jake fell silent, stung. "The river has flooded," the old man continued. "Your path is underwater. My path, longer but higher, and leads to the temple." Two philosophies collided in the night: calculation versus experience, numbers versus legends. Jake looked at his phone. 41%. He opened the map. Yes, the blue line of the river was unnaturally wide. The satellite images used to build the map were taken in the dry season. For the first time, his data was not just useless, but potentially lethal. "All right," he surrendered, feeling the last bastion of his confidence crumble. "We go your way. But if we don't find anything in a day, we turn back to my coordinates. Agreed?" Ashwin nodded. "Agreed."
The next morning, they prepared to leave. Moving Kapil was impossible. They left him as many supplies as possible, water bottles, and built a better canopy over him. Ashwin treated the wound again with his paste. In the pilot's eyes, when he briefly regained consciousness, there was a silent question and fear. Jake couldn't bear his gaze. "We'll be back with help," he promised, knowing it might be a lie. They set out at dawn. Ashwin walked ahead, his pace unhurried but incredibly steady. He didn't look at his feet. They felt the ground themselves. He navigated not by the sun or compass, but by some invisible signs of his own. A broken branch, specific moss on stones, barely noticeable animal trails. Jake followed behind, constantly checking his phone. The compass showed they were moving generally east, but with constant deviations. He felt blind. "Why are we zigzagging?" he asked, when they once again detoured around a patch of thorny bushes instead of going through them. "We're wasting time." "The straight path is the fool's path," Ashwin said without turning around. "Thorns tear clothes, dirt gets in cuts, infection starts. You want to be like him?" He nodded back towards where they came from. Jake fell silent again. His analytical mind, deprived of external data, began analyzing Ashwin's approach itself. It wasn't magic. It was hyper-efficient heuristics, an algorithm honed by generations. An algorithm not written in a book, but woven into the DNA of a culture. They reached the river, or rather, what was the river. Now, it was a raging brown torrent, dozens of meters wide, carrying branches, whole trees, and churning with foam. Jake's map showed a narrow stream here.
"See," said Ashwin, "your bath, underwater. How do we cross? Not here, upstream. There is a place, narrow, with rocks." They walked along the bank for several more hours. Jake began to notice patterns in Ashwin's behavior. He listened to the birds. Their sudden silence made him slow down and change direction. Once, this saved them from an encounter with a wild boar they only glimpsed. Jake took out his phone. 33%. He turned off everything except the map and compass. He felt like a cripple, tied to this fragile device. Finally, they reached the spot. The river narrowed here between two rocky outcrops, and a huge fallen tree, a natural bridge, spanned it. But it was wet, slippery, and half a meter submerged in the churning water. "We can't," Jake said in horror, looking at this precarious path. "No other way," Ashwin said simply. "Or back." The thought of returning to the dying Kapil empty-handed was unbearable. Jake gritted his teeth. "I'll go first." He crawled along the trunk on all fours, clinging to the wet bark. The water slammed into his legs with furious force, trying to tear him off. Every centimeter was torture. His heart hammered in his throat. He didn't look down, only forward, at the other bank. He made it across. His hands were shaking as he slid onto solid ground. Now it was Ashwin's turn. The old man moved slower, but with incredible grace. He didn't crawl, he walked, slightly spreading his arms for balance, his bare feet gripping the bark like suction cups. He was part of this world, while Jake was just a clumsy guest. Then, halfway across, there was a crack. The old trunk, undermined by water, snapped right under Ashwin's feet. Jake cried out. Ashwin disappeared into the churning brown water.
Jake stood frozen on the bank, peering in horror at the torrent. 10 seconds passed. 20. Panic seized him. He was alone. Completely alone. Then he saw Ashwin's head. The current had carried the old man. He was desperately clinging to another, thicker branch on his original bank. He had been thrown back to where they started. They stood on opposite banks, separated by the roaring stream. Shouting was useless. Ashwin was signaling to him with his hands. First, he pointed at Jake, then east, then folded his hands by his cheek as if sleeping, and again east. Go alone, to the temple, save Kapil. Then he pointed at the sun, to the west, and at himself. I will go back to the plain. Wait. Jake understood. It was the only logical way out. But the thought of going on alone horrified him. Ashwin gave him an encouraging wave, turned, and slowly trudged back into the jungle toward the camp. Jake was alone, on an unfamiliar shore, with a dying man behind him and a phantom hope ahead. He looked at his phone. 29%. He opened the map. His path, straight and logical, was cut off by the river. Ashwin's path was unknown to him. He was at a point that wasn't on the map. He took a deep breath. Panic wasn't an algorithm. He had to think. He remembered everything he had seen over the past 2 days, how Ashwin looked at moss on trees, thicker on the north side, how he listened to the water. The sound of a village or waterfall could carry on the wind. How he looked for certain plants that only grew on high ground. Jake turned off the compass. He didn't trust it anymore. He looked at the moss, determined north, remembered that Ashwin had been leading them generally east, and he walked. He walked slowly, constantly checking with nature, He wasn't as good as Ashwin, but he was learning. He stopped fighting the jungle and started reading it. It was the most difficult task of his life, decompiling code not written by man. By evening, he was exhausted, but alive. He found some edible berries, identified by Ashwin's description, not by the app, drank water from a vine the old man had shown him. He spent the night in the hollow of a huge tree, pressed against the trunk, listening to the night sounds. He was afraid, but the fear was different now. Not the paralyzing terror of ignorance, but a cautious respect for the world around him. The next day, he walked east again. His clothes were in tatters, his body covered in insect bites, but he walked. And closer to noon, pushing through thickets, he saw it. Not a temple as he had imagined, not a majestic building. A pile of dark gray stones almost completely consumed by vines and moss, but it was a creation of human hands. Steps leading nowhere, remains of a wall, and in the center, a stone archway leading into semi-darkness. He had found it, the temple. Thanks not to his calculations, but to the lessons of the old man he initially considered ignorant. He approached the archway, his heart pounding wildly. What would he find inside? Salvation? Or just more ruins? He took a step inside, from the monsoon season into the eternal, cool shade of the past. Inside, it was tomb silent, broken only by the rustle of a lizard hiding in a crack between stones. The air was thick and smelled of damp earth, mold, and something else, a faint, barely perceptible scent of sandalwood and thyme. The temple was tiny, just one room, its dome partially collapsed, letting in columns of murky light and streams of rain. In the center stood a badly damaged stone statue of a multi-armed deity, its face almost completely erased by time and lichen. On the walls, where the stone was protected from the weather, faded frescoes were discernible, images of dancing figures, elephants, and lotuses. Jake stood on the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The first thing he felt was bitter disappointment. There was no first aid kit, no traces of civilization, only stones and dust. Ashwin was wrong, he thought. These are just ruins. But then his gaze, accustomed to seeking patterns, caught something strange. At the base of the statue, in a niche protected from water, lay a bundle, not a modern one, but wrapped in a piece of oiled leather and tied with twine. His heart beat faster again. He cautiously approached and picked up the bundle. The leather was stiff and brittle, but untouched by rot. He untied the twine. Inside wasn't a book, but a stack of palm leaves covered with neat, faded script. Brahmi? Sanskrit? He didn't know. But next to the text were drawings, very detailed and realistic. He leafed through a few leaves and froze. One drawing depicted a plant with characteristic leaves and a flower. Next to it, a schematic of a person with an inflamed wound on his leg and an arrow pointing to the root of this plant. Below was an inscription he couldn't read, but the meaning was crystal clear. It was a medical manuscript. He feverishly began sorting through the leaves. Here was a drawing of a feverish man and the bark of a tree to be ground into powder. Here, an image of a snake and an antidote plant. Here, a diagram for preparing a decoction for dysentery. This wasn't superstition. This was a pharmacopoeia. Ancient, empirical, but based on real knowledge. His phone lay in his pocket, a useless weight. He couldn't photograph and identify. He would have to find the plants from these drawings, relying solely on his visual memory. Then his gaze fell on the last leaf in the stack. There were no drawings. There was a map, scratched with a fine needle on the palm leaf. It depicted a hill, the temple, a river, and a trail leading to a group of small houses, a village. And the path to it was marked not with a straight line, but with a zigzag, with markings of specific trees and rock formations. Ashwin's path, the very one they had taken, only ancient. Jake sank onto the stone floor, stunned. Ashwin's knowledge wasn't just grandfather's. It was part of an unbroken tradition stretching back centuries. This temple wasn't just a holy place. It was a library, a university of the jungle.
He didn't need a compass or GPS. He needed this map and his eyes. He carefully rewrapped the priceless manuscript in the leather and hid it in an inner pocket, pressing it against his chest. Now he had a plan. Find the plant for Kapil's wound depicted on the first leaf and follow the ancient map to the village. He stepped out of the temple, and the world outside took on new colors. Now he didn't just see a chaos of green. He saw potential medicines, landmarks, road signs left by ancient cartographers. He was looking at the jungle through Ashwin's eyes, and through the eyes of the nameless sages who had left him this message. The rain seemed to be letting up. Briefly, the monsoon season was giving him a respite.
According to the manuscript, the plant that could draw out pus and calm the fever of the flesh was a vine with dark green, leathery, heart-shaped leaves and small yellow star-like flowers. It was supposed to grow in shady, damp places, often at the foot of old trees. Jake spent several hours searching, comparing every inch of vegetation with the image in his memory. He found dozens of similar vines, but none matched perfectly. Despair began to creep in again. To possess knowledge and to be able to apply it were different things. Finally, in a crevice between the roots of a giant banyan tree, he saw it, the very vine. The flowers were exactly as in the drawing, small, yellow, 5-petaled. A strange mix of triumph and awe washed over him. He hadn't found a weed. He had deciphered a message hundreds of years old. Carefully, following the manuscript's instructions, he used a shard of mirror to cut pieces of bark and root. The plant had a strong, earthy smell. Now, the village. He unfolded the leather map in his mind. From the temple, go east until you find the stone resembling an elephant's head. He looked around, and within 15 minutes he found it. A large boulder with a long curved protrusion, indeed resembling a trunk. From the elephant, the trail led southeast to the tree with weeping branches, a banyan whose aerial roots hung to the ground like streams of water. He was here. He was walking the same path generations of people had trod.
His confidence grew with every step. He was no longer blind. He was reading the landscape like a book. He wasn't just surviving. He was following a plan. The path wasn't easy. He had to scramble over a landslide, detour around another flooded stream. But now he understood the logic of these detours. The straight path was dangerous. The path of the sages was safe. At sunset on the second day of his solo journey, passing through a bamboo thicket as indicated on the map, he came to the edge of a hill and froze. Below, in a valley shrouded in evening mist, lay a village. Several dozen roofs covered with palm leaves, smoke rising to the sky, figures of people and animals. It was Manali, not a dot on a digital map, but a living, breathing place. He descended the hill, his legs buckling from fatigue and emotion. The first people to see him, a woman with a pot on her head and 2 children, stopped, and stared at him in astonishment. He must have looked like a ghost, dirty, ragged, with eyes burning with a feverish gleam. He tried to say something, but only a croak came out. He just pointed to his own injured side, mimicking a wound, and uttered the only word he hoped they would understand. Plain. Understanding flashed in the woman's eyes. She shouted something, and within minutes the village came alive. People gathered around him. The village headman, an elderly man with glasses, spoke to him in broken English. Plane? Crashed? You... from there? Jake could only nod. He pulled the crumpled pieces of bark and root from his pocket. Antibiotics. And pilot. There, injured. Very bad. He tried to explain about Ashwin, about Kapil, but his strength finally left him. Strong arms caught him, carried him into the village. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the headman's face, giving rapid orders, and a group of men preparing stretchers and gathering supplies. They understood. Help was coming.
Jake woke up the next day on a simple wooden bed in a hut. His wounds and scrapes were cleanly washed and bandaged with fresh leaves. A bowl of steaming vegetable stew and a cup of herbal tea stood on a table nearby. The headman came in. "Your friends. We found them," he said. Jake's heart sank. Found could mean anything. "The pilot, alive, by a miracle. Your old man, he was making compresses from some herbs for him. Was very bad, but he held on. They're being brought here now. Our men went with stretchers." The relief that washed over Jake was so powerful his vision darkened. Kapil was alive. Ashwin, he had returned. He had kept his word. A few hours later, a group of bearers arrived in the village. Kapil, pale as a sheet but breathing, lay on an improvised stretcher. Ashwin walked beside him. Seeing Jake sitting at the entrance to the hut, the headman stopped. Something resembling respect showed on his usually impassive face. They looked at each other in silence. No words were needed. The village medic, who had a supply of real antibiotics, examined Kapil. "Another day or two," he shook his head. "But these herbs, they really slowed the infection. Who did this?" All eyes turned to Ashwin, who stood modestly to the side. Jake went over to him. "I found the temple," he said quietly, "and the manuscript. The plant you used was there, and a map. Your map." Ashwin nodded, as if this were self-evident. "Knowledge old, like the hills. Sometimes forgotten, but not lost." Taking his smartphone, Jake looked at the screen one last time. Charge, 3%. He opened the mapping app. It showed his current location almost a kilometer from the actual village. Data inaccuracy. He looked at Ashwin, at the village, at the rescued pilot. He remembered the palm leaves with their flawless drawings. He realized he had been wrong. His technology wasn't useless. It was just limited. It was the map, not the territory. And Ashwin's knowledge, the knowledge of the sages from the temple, that was the knowledge of the territory itself. He didn't press any buttons. He just watched as the phone screen dimmed and then went black completely. The battery died. He put the dead gadget in his pocket. He didn't need it anymore. At least not here and now. He lifted his head and breathed in the air, smelling of smoke, food, and rain. The air of the real world. He had survived, not thanks to his algorithms, but because he had learned to listen to the whisper of an old man and the silent voice of the ancient jungle. The monsoon season wasn't over yet, but for Jake Peters, the most terrible storm, The storm of his own ignorance had already subsided.